Welcome to Blue Nile Tutorials. Today, we're covering an important topic in auditing, relying on the work of others. Auditors often use the work of other professionals or specialists, such as internal auditors, valuation experts, or ID professionals, to gather evidence or form conclusions. However, this reliance must be carefully assessed to ensure the quality and reliability of the audit. When do auditors rely on others? Internal auditors, for understanding internal controls or performing specific testing, provided their work is independent and objective. Experts or specialists, for complex areas like valuations, actuarial calculations, or legal matters requiring specialized knowledge. Component auditors, in group audits, where subsidiary or branch audits are performed by different auditors. How do auditors evaluate the work of others? Competence and objectivity. Assess the qualifications, experience. Let's get started with more insights and examples in our tutorials. This video will discuss how the external auditor relies on the work of others. We must understand who the auditor would rely on and why. Considerations made before reliance is placed, and relying on evidence from service organizations. During the audit process, the auditor must ensure they obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. In order to do this, they may need to obtain evidence from individual parties who can then back up the auditor's findings to ensure they come to an appropriate opinion on the financial statements. This may be due to a lack of technical knowledge on a matter, or it is the most efficient way of obtaining evidence. We can split when auditors rely on others into two groups: when the auditor uses their own expert, and when they rely on the client's experts. Auditors may use their own experts in the following situations: using a property valuer to verify property figures in the financial statements, bringing in an inventory expert to assist with valuing specialist inventory such as jewelry, experts to assist with work-in-progress values in the financial statements, and legal advice on provisions made for any legal cases connected to the client. When an auditor uses their own expert, they must assess their competence and independence from the client. If they're going to rely on their work, they need to ensure they will still be able to form an appropriate independent auditor opinion overall. ISA 620 states that the auditor is to ensure that they obtain sufficient appropriate evidence from the expert so they can provide reasonable assurance on the client's financial statements. In order for the evidence to be adequate for the audit, the auditor should review qualifications, experience, and membership to any professional bodies, and review any connections with the client to identify any business or personal relationships with them. This is to ensure objectivity will not be affected. Any use of an independent expert should be communicated to the client before work begins. This is usually laid out in the engagement letter, so both parties agree to the terms of the audit at the start of the audit process. Auditors may also wish to rely on experts used by the client in operating their business and preparing the financial statements. This could be relying on the client's lawyer's documentation for assessments of legal provisions and disclosure in the financial statements, or relying on the internal auditor's work to assist with the external audit. The internal audit department would be a fundamental part of the entity's control system. They also carry out procedures on the control systems connected to the financial statements, identify deficiencies, and implement changes. The external auditor must also assess control systems for deficiencies. This helps them plan whether controls can be relied upon and decide the level of substantive testing needed. Therefore, the type of work the auditor could rely on would be test of control, risk assessment, and any special investigations such as fraud investigations. For any experts used by the client, care needs to be taken before the auditor can go ahead and rely on any of their work as evidence. the auditor must consider the following. The scope of work. The auditor should review the level of detail put in by the client expert. Remember, the auditor must provide reasonable assurance on the financial statements, and therefore there must be sufficient detailed work carried out by the expert. If the work is not sufficient, the auditor will need to carry out further work or gather further evidence on this area. Technical competence. The auditor must assess whether the expert has the required technical competence to carry out the quality of the work required. The auditor should review qualifications and experience of the expert to assess whether reliance can be placed. Report quality. Evidence collected is fundamental in forming an independent opinion. If sufficient appropriate evidence cannot be obtained, the expert cannot be relied upon wholly. For example, it may be that the internal auditor communicates much of their findings with presentations or discussions with the board of directors. Ideally, auditors want detailed written evidence, and without it, they may still need to carry out further work themselves. Independence. If used by the client themselves, independence is unlikely. In many cases, the internal auditors are employees. However, if an audit committee is formed of non-executive directors, and they liaise with the internal auditors, then independence from the board is improved. The less independence the expert has from the entity, the less reliance can be placed on their work. Finally, let's look at the considerations the auditor makes on relying on a service organization used by the client. This is an outsourced function the client has used instead of having a fully functioning department employed by the business. A popular example is the payroll department being outsourced to a skilled payroll company. If the client outsources one of its functions such as payroll, the auditor must understand the service organization and assess the risk of material misstatements. Decide on the level of audit testing and design audit procedures appropriate in identifying potential material misstatements. And consider visiting the service organization. Advantages of the client using a service organization include increased expertise and skills, which potentially reduce material misstatements, and increased independence from directors, which improves reliability. Disadvantages include being able to obtain information on a timely basis, which may be difficult. They may not be allowed to perform audit work at the service organization, and this could lead to not being able to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, which would affect the audit opinion. There are many sources who can assist the auditor in gathering evidence. The key is to assess whether these experts are needed before the audit commences. That way, the auditor can plan the work required, so evidence can be collected on a timely basis, and no disruption is made to the audit, and ultimately the forming of the audit opinion. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for watching.